Hello, welcome back. This is Sharper Pen Image Consulting. I'm Zach Markowski, and today I'll be reading George Orwell's famous essay, Politics in the English Language. And if I'm not mistaken, this is actually supposedly the most printed and reprinted essay in the English language. So, beginning from the top, it starts. Most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that English language is in a bad way, that the English language is in a bad way, but it is generally assumed that we cannot by conscious action do anything about it. No, Mr. Orwell. Don't you see? The English language is good. Sure, it's not double good, and it could be double plus good, but it's plenty good. You know what? If we try harder, we could make it double plus good, right? But he goes on, our civilization is decadent and our language, so the argument runs, must inevitably share in the general collapse. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, or preferring candles to electric light, or hansom cabs to aeroplanes. Underneath this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. Now, it is clear that the decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer, but an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. Right? It's just like Winston learns in 1984, right, that you can control people's perception by controlling their thoughts, by controlling the amounts and kinds of languages and images and things that, like, basically the point is what modern man learned from psychology. Basically, we stopped evolving at behavioral conditioning, operant conditioning. It's like, hey, we figured out how to train monkeys, how to make them dance, how to make them work. You know, you can dangle meat, you can dangle prizes. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. It is rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. So it's become a drunk. The English language is indeed drunk on its own symbolism and doublespeak. English language, it becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. The point is that the process is reversible. Yes, we're going to fix you. Modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits, which spread by imitation and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. If one gets rid of these kinds of habits, one can think more clearly, and to think clearly is a necessary first step toward political regeneration. So that the fight against bad English is not frivolous and is not exclusive concern of professional writers. I will come back to this presently, and I hope that by the time the meaning of what I have said here will have become clearer. Meanwhile, here are 5 specimens of the English language as it is now habitually written. These 5 passages have not been picked because they are especially bad. I could have quoted far worse if I had chosen, but because they illustrate various of the mental vices from which we now suffer. They are a little below the average, but are fairly representative examples. And think about it, just average English writing of his time. The funniest thing about these examples, you'll see it's like no one ever stopped writing this way. It's like you guys got worse. You got dumber and worse because you've just been treading these shallow political waters. That's become what mainstream culture has become, what art has become. It's all the most shallow, redundant, ever more narrowed, and arguably retarded in its growth and its spread, right? This is what Orwell is saying. He doesn't think the damage is not permanent, like anything else. If people learn badly, if people learn stupidly, perhaps you have a stupid teacher, right? And then you can reverse that damage. Say, okay, that teacher taught you that that chair is a bus. No, the bus is a chair and the chair is a bus, right? That airplane's an airplane and that's the sky. This is the ground. 2 + 2 = 4, right? You know, and I guess from a psychological perspective, you could say, what do you call it? Cult deprogramming. There's a reason that works. There's a reason why diffusing violence works. There's a reason why talk therapy works. There's a reason why many psychological approaches to life, including the manipulation of man through political language, work. So, people say it's, I've heard people kind of, I'm not going to say they say it, they parrot it. People keep parroting this idea that the modern war is a war for the soul. And it's like, yes, namely, it's a war against the human mind, just to simply control it, to control how it spends its time, what it thinks about, how it supports its whatever nation state it's connected to, right? Because wherever there are herds of people, there are states. Where there are actual human beings, there aren't states, right? Um, but this is the example of the herd being. Like, this is herd language. This is common bad English language as is commonly written. So he goes on with the first example. I'm not indeed sure whether if, sorry, this is really bad. I'm not indeed sure whether it is not true to say that the Milton who once seemed not unlike a 17th century Shelley had not become, out of an experience ever more bitter in each year, more alien to the founder of that Jesuit sect with nothing could induce him to tolerate. Professor Harold Lasky, Essay in Freedom of Expression. Oh, there's a cliche. Expression. I think you guys are sick to death on expression. Number two, above all, we cannot play ducks and drakes with the native battery of idioms which prescribes egregious collocations of vocables as the basic put up with for tolerate, or put up at a loss for bewilder. Professor Terrible Metaphor. Professor Lancelot Hogbin, Interglossia. You got to understand that a lot of writers, like, this is them masturbating, right? This is them getting off on what little pleasures they can find in life. On the one side, and feel the need to write like this. On the one side, we have the free personality. By definition, it is not neurotic, for it is neither conflict nor dream. Its desires, such as they are transparent, for they are just what institutional approval keeps in the forefront of consciousness. Another institutional pattern would alter the number and intensity. There is little in them that is natural, irreducible, or culturally dangerous. But on the other side, the social bond itself is nothing but the mutual reflection of these self-secure integrities. Recall the definition of love. Is not this the very picture of a small academic? Where is there a place in this hall of mirrors for either personality or fraternity? Essay on Psychology and Politics, New York. Funny. I find that one a little bit more acceptable, and it's maybe because it's American and a little less hoity-toity English. By that I mean silly English or dumb scholar English. For all the best people from the Gentlemen's Club and the frantic fascist captains united in common hatred of socialism and bestial horror at the rising tide of the mass revolutionary movement have turned to acts of provocation, to foul incendiarism, to medieval legends of poisoned wells. You need to bang on the podium right for this kind of stuff. To legalize their own destruction of proletariat organizations and rouse the agitated petty bourgeoisie to chauvinistic fervor on behalf of the fight against the revolutionary way put out of the crisis. Communist pamphlet. It's exciting. 5. If a new spirit is to be fused into this old country, oh God, it's so boring. There is one thorny and contentious reform which must be tackled, and that is the humanization and galvanization of the BBC. Timidity here will bespeak canker and atrophy of the soul. The heart of Britain may be boring. May sound on in a be of strong beat, for instance. How are they doing these days? By the way, don't look at the news. Funny, the anarchy in the UK, that is not prevalent in our news at the moment. And I think that's by design, right? The revolution will not be televised, at least not how you hope. The heart of Britain may be sound and of strong beat, for instance, but the British lion's roar at present is like that of bottom of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh, there you go. You see, they're getting emotional. They're drawing in the voice of their poets, right? To use it for politics, of course. As gentle as any sucking dove, a virile New Britain cannot contain indefinitely to be traduced in the eyes of rather ears of the world by the effete languors of Langham Place brazenly masquerading as standard English. When the voice of Britain is heard at 9 o'clock, better far and infinitely less ludicrous to hear at H's honestly drop than the present priggish, inflated, inhibited, school-mammish arch-braying of blameless, bashful, mewing maidens. Damn straight. Letter in the Tribune. He's calling you, and that one it's funny because it's like basically an inflated, fancy way of calling you, his political opponents a bunch of sissies, a bunch of sissy liberals, basically. It sounds like. So Orwell goes on. Excuse me. Each of these passages has faults of its own, but quite apart from avoidable ugliness, two qualities are common to all of them. The first is staleness of imagery. The other is lack of precision. Yes, like they're firing up nothing in my third eye. It's all bland. I've heard and read this stuff a million times before. The first is staleness of imagery. The other is lack of precision. Right? The verboseness, the excess lexical crap. Right? The overflow of their impressive vocabulary, you could say. Right? Um, is exactly what contributes to the lack of precision. Orwell gets into suggesting that if you're writing for a clear purpose, like unless you're writing to bullshit people, it's best to just be clear about what you mean. But, that's part of his political criticism here of political writing. So the writer either has a meaning and cannot express it, right? And there's a reason why, or he inadvertently says something else, or he is almost indifferent as to whether his words mean anything or not. This mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose. Yes, and I'm going to say it again. You guys, especially you Americans, you've gotten worse than ever. This mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence, right, and especially of any kind of political writing. As soon as certain topics are raised, the concrete melts into the abstract, and no one seems able to think of turns of speech that are not hackneyed. Prose consists less and less of words chosen to the sake of their meaning, and more of phrases tacked together like the sections of a prefabricated henhouse. Right? This is the postmodern nightmare of, okay, great, we've created this ever more expansive yet meaningless pit of abstractions. It's like digging out garbage out of the human psyche, and you just turn that soil over and over, and after a while you see, while it works for criticism, that nothing actually grows there, because nothing can grow there, because there's no meaning to it. People don't have time or money for what doesn't mean anything to them. It's just people won't buy it, right? And again, you can bullshit them, you can sneak it past them, you can force it down their throat, but reality eventually catches up. And the reality is usually violence. Anyway, he goes on. So he lists below, with notes and examples, various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose constructually is habitually dodged. And right, basically, it's a certain drunkenness and fervor on the symbolism of language, the excitement of language. There's an indulgence to it, right? He's talking about how he's saying that prose construction is dodged, and that's because he's saying that political writers actually aren't writers. They're not thinkers. They're agents of the state who just exist to put together this kind of garbage because they're not interested in humanity. They're not interested in literature. They're not interested in creating beautiful language or prose. They're interested in manipulating people, right? And basically, if you understand where 1984 comes from, where this essay comes from, he wrote, I think, this essay, and basically 1984 based off of this essay, more or less. The concept of, well, why are people even doing this? Why do people write like this? I might have that backwards, by the way, but one inspired the other, more or less, is the point. And you can see that, especially if you've read and understand the book 1984. Dying metaphors. A newly invented metaphor assists thought by evoking a visual image, right? By creating an image in the head. While on the other hand, a metaphor which is technically dead, e.g. iron resolution, right? This was iron resolution was a cliche 75 years ago, has in effect reverted to being an ordinary word and can generally be used without a loss of vividness. But in between these two classes, there is a huge dump of worn-out metaphors which have lost all evocative power and are merely used because they save people the trouble of inventing phrases for themselves. Um, Examples are ring the changes on, take up the cudgels for, toe the line, ride roughshod over, stand shoulder to shoulder with, play into the hands of, no axe to grind, grist to the mill, fishing in troubled waters, on the order of the day, Achilles' heel, swan song, hotbed. Many of these are used without knowledge of their meaning, which is what is a rift, for instance, and incompatible metaphors are frequently mixed, a sure sign that the writer is not interested in what he is saying. Some metaphors now currently have been twisted out of their original meaning without those who use them even being aware of the fact. For example, toe the line is sometimes written as toe the line, right? T-O-E the line, now written as T-O-W the line. Another example is the hammer and the anvil, now always used with the implication that the anvil gets the worst of it. In real life, it is always the anvil that breaks the hammer. Dummies. Never the other way about. A writer who stopped to think about what he is saying would avoid perverting the original phrase, right? Because the whole point is, okay, are you writing to be clear about a meaning? If not, why should anyone listen to you if you're just mucking up the water and not getting to your point, right? He's talking about political writing, because remember, guys, there exists whole subclasses of writing and poetry and language that are about individuals and particular groups. It's not democratic. Language has never been democratic. There's always been class divides in and about language. And politics is basically figuring out how to leverage those divides. Like in America, for instance, it's really funny, where I live, you can hate someone for everything they are except their race. That's wrong. Hating them for anything and everything else, especially what they think and what they feel or their politics, that's actually encouraged. So basically, you see how you use language to turn a class war into a race war. So he goes on. Operators or verbal false limbs, right? These are examples of the worst sort of cases of abuse in the English language. False verbal limbs. These save the trouble of picking out appropriate verbs and nouns, and at the same time pad each sentence with extra syllables which give it an appearance of symmetry. Characteristic phrases, they're really pretentious usually, right? Characteristic phrases are render inoperative, militate against, prove unacceptable, make contact with, to be subject to, give rise to, right? They can't just use a simple verb. Give grounds for, have the effect of, play a leading part, role in, make effect itself, take effect, exhibit a tendency to. It's like when you realize what politics are, it's like the subjective lie of objectively scapegoating people, the subjective lie of objectively creating scapegoats, right? Basically creating enemies, calling for demons, those sorts of things, right? Um, Serve the purpose of, exhibit a tendency to. The keynote of the elimination of simple verbs, instead of being a single word such as break, stop, spoil, mend, kill, a verb becomes a phrase made up of a noun or adjective tacked onto some general purposes verbs such as prove, serve, form, play, render. In addition, the passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, right? And I think that's the predatory nature of the passive voice. That's why you don't trust it. Or the objective voice too, for that matter, right? You sneak all sorts of things under the lie of objectivity. In addition, the passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, and noun constructions are used instead of gerunds, by examination of instead of by examining. The range of verbs is further cut down by means of the dash I's and D dash formations, and banal statements are given an appearance of profundity by means of a not formation. Simple conjunctions and prepositions are replaced by such phrases as with respect to, having regard to, the fact that, by dint of, in view of, in the interest of, the hypothesis that, and at the end of sentences are saved from anticlimax by such resounding commonplaces as greatly to be desired, cannot be left out of account, a development to be expected in the near future, deserving of serious consideration, brought to a satisfactory conclusion, and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to examine examine the inanity of the language used here, right? And also, that you've seen and heard this before. Here we go. Pretentious diction. Words like phenomenon, element, individual as noun, objective, categorical, effective, virtual, basic, primary, promote, constitute, exhibit, exploit, utilize, eliminate, liquidate are used to dress up simple statements and give an air of scientific impartiality to biased judgments. We will eliminate millions of the enemy, right? Well, you probably shouldn't say that, politically speaking. You got to be more subtle if you're talking about genocide and murder, right? Um, Adjectives like epoch-making, epic, historic, unforgettable, triumphant, age-old, inevitable, inexorable, veritable are used to dignify the sordid processes of international politics. I almost want to look at the headlines and see what they say. Maybe we'll get to that at the end here. While writing, what aims at glorifying war usually takes on an archaic color, its characteristic words being realm, throne, chariot, mailed fist, trident, sword, shield, buckler, banner, jackboot, clarion. Foreign words and expressions such as cul-de-sac, ancient regime, deus ex machina, mutatis mutandis, status quo, Gleichstellung, Weltanschauung are used to give an air of culture and elegance, right? They'll just flood in whatever non-English words wherever, right? Except for the useful abbreviations, i.e., e.g., and etc., there is no real need for any of the hundreds of foreign phrases now current in English. Bad writers, and especially scientific, political, and sociological writers, are nearly always haunted by the notion that Latin or Greek words are grander than the Saxon ones. Yeah, you guys are just pretentious. And unnecessary words like expedite, ameliorate, predict, extraneous, deracinated, clandestine, subaqueous, and hundreds of others constantly gain ground from their Anglo-Saxon opposite numbers. I'll say, see, I'll make one exception here, and that's poetry, because as in rhythm and language in general, because as Symes observes in 1984, all of the whole history of English poetry, including Shakespeare, was absolutely shaped by and limited to the very rhyming, the fact that so few words have so few rhymes in total, uh, other than words that are identical for themselves, right? Like, so I'm accepting language for poetry and creative expression, but again, when you're talking about basic English writing, for the purpose of communicating meaning, but that's also the game that's being played. So there's a footnote here. The jargon peculiar to Marxist writing, hyena, hangman, cannibal, petty bourgeoisie, these gentry, right? There's like the Rousseauian, the fire dog, right? He always wants to incite and excite people. That's why you use the scary imagery, right? There's an art to all this. Hyena, hangman, cannibal, petty bourgeoisie, these gentry, hacky, flunky, mad dog, white guard, etc., consists largely of words translated from Russian, German, or French. But the normal way of coining a new word is to use a Latin or Greek root with the appropriate affix and, where necessary, the eyes formation, dash eyes, right, to cannibalize. It is often easier to make up words of this kind: deregionalized, impermissible, extramarital, non-fragmentary, and so forth, than to think up the English words that will cover one's meaning. The result in general is an increase in slovenliness and vagueness. On to the next section, meaningless words. In certain kinds of writing, particularly in art criticism and literary criticism, oh man, I've seen so much of this, I've read so much of this, and then you realize like it's all the same. It's almost like the same mind writing the same slop, and then you just go, how'd they do that? It is normal to come across long passages which are almost completely lacking in meaning. Words like romantic, plastic, values, human, dead, sentimental, natural, vitality, as used in art criticism, are strictly meaningless in the sense that they do not only not point to any discoverable object, but are hardly even expected to do so by the reader, right? You're just supposed to let it wash in one ear and out the other, just brainlessly. When one critic writes, "The outstanding feature of Mr. X's work is its living quality," while another writes, "The immediately striking thing about Mr. X's work is its peculiar deadness." Yes, its peculiar deadness. When I say deadness, I mean a projection of my dead and pretentious soul. Anyway, The reader accepts this is a simple difference of opinion. No, these are bad people. If words like black and white were involved instead of the jargon words dead and living, he would see at once what language was being used in an improper way. Many political words are similarly abused, and the word fascism has now no meaning except insofar as it signifies something not desirable. That's like a hell of a criticism of liberals of his time. Because remember, they're like 75 years ago, and if fascism meant nothing then, you better believe it means nothing now. Um, the words democracy, socialism, freedom, patriotic, realistic, justice have each of them several different meanings which cannot be reconciled with one another. Oh yeah, and then people use them willy-nilly, and it's never clear what they actually mean in political writing because no one actually agrees on what any of these things mean anyway. So it's intentionally vague on purpose, right? You can just insert the word freedom, and whether you're left or right, you just assume people are going to insert or project, again, your party's definition, depending on your party's language. Anyway, in the case of a word like democracy, not only, it's a fictional word, not only is there not any agreed upon definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides, right? The vaguer you leave it, the more you can realize it's fiction. It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is all a democracy and fear that they might have to stop using that word if it were tied down to any one meaning. Words of this kind are often used in consciously dishonest ways. That is, the person who uses them has his own private definition, but allows his hearer to think he means something quite different. What did I just say? People use all these terminologies and jargons because the more intelligent party members know how to manipulate both the inner and the outer party members as well as the proles themselves. So everyone's playing the con game, but allow his hearer to think he means, that's what I said about they allow the reader to put their own projection, their own party definition. Statements like, Marshal Pétain was a true patriot. The Soviet press is the freest in the world. The Catholic Church is opposed to persecution, are almost always made with the intent to deceive. Other words used in variable meanings, in most cases more or less dishonestly, are class, totalitarian, science, progressive, reactionary, bourgeoisie, equality. Right, all fairy tales. All fairy tales sold by a corporation state to cover the fact that it sold out, it sold out the proles. They were never part of the picture. Actually, is actually the more honest thing. Is just by way of modern economy and modern industry, they were able to dress them up a little bit nicer, um, and until that became no longer possible. So other words used, class, totalitarian, science, progressive, right, fictions. Now that I've made this catalog of swindles and perversions, let me give another example of the kind of writings that they lead to. This time it must be of its nature be an imaginary one. I'm going to translate a passage of good English into modern English. Of the worst sort, here is a well-known verse from Ecclesiastes. So here's the Old Testament verse right here. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to the men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Here it is in modern English. So now he's going to write it, maybe objective consideration of contemporary phenomenon compels the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. This is a parody, but not a very gross one. Exhibit 3 above, for instance, contains several patches of the same kind of English. It will be seen that I have not made a full translation. The beginning and ending of the sentence follows the original meaning fairly closely, but in the middle the concrete illustrations, race, battle, bread, dissolve into vague phrases, success or failure in competitive activities, right? Rob the humanity and the reality right out of it. This has to be so because no modern writer of this kind I am discussing, known capable of using phrases like objective, consideration of contemporary phenomenon, would ever tabulate his thoughts in that precise and detailed way. He's saying that they would never actually be as clear and poetic and yet as concise as Ecclesiastes is. See, and this is the lie of is that political and scientific language is somehow more clear and concise, when in truth, literature can show you far more quickly too. And that is like basically what 1984 illustrates, especially in context with this essay. The whole tendency of modern prose is away from concreteness. Now analyze these two sentences a little more closely. The first contains 49 words but only 60 syllables, and all its words are those of everyday life. The second contains 38 words of 90 syllables, 18 of its words are from Latin roots and one from Greek. The first sentence contains 6 vivid images and one phrase, time and chance, that could be called vague. The second contains not a single fresh arresting phrase, right? No, there's no simile, there's no metaphor. The second contains not a single fresh, okay, it only gives, in its 90 syllables, it gives only a shortened version of the meaning contained in the first. So it reduces, it doesn't just rephrase, it reduces it, right? It somehow became a longer sentence, right? It became, the first contains, the second contains 38 words, 90 syllables. Okay, so it has more sounds, it's longer, right? It's longer, but it means less. Notice how you can use language to just utterly bullshit people, right? Has anyone noticed that you can do that? Here in America, our whole country runs on that. Marketing, politics, business, scam artistry. Yet without a doubt is a second kind of sentence that is gaining ground in modern English, right? So it's worse, but it's what's gained ground. I do not want to exaggerate. This kind of writing is not yet universal, and outcrops of simplicity will occur here and there in the worst written page. Still, if you or I were to write a few lines on the uncertainty of human fortunes, we should probably come much nearer to my imaginary sentence than the one of Ecclesiastes, right? He's showing you how modern brains have changed. He's showing you how modern people think. Journalism has changed the way people think. The fact that most people write and read at a very low grade level has changed the way modern people think, is an example of how modern people think, is the modern thought process that has been made up. Ecclesiastes predates them all. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's bad imitation. As I tried to show, modern writing at its worst does not consist in picking out words for the sake of their meaning and inventing images in order to make the meaning clearer. It consists in gumming together long strips of words which have already been set in order by someone else and making the results presentable by sheer humbug. The attraction of this way of writing is that it's easy. It's easier, even quicker, once you have the habit to say, in my opinion, it is not an unjustifiable assumption that blah, 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 blah. If you use ready-made phrases, you not only don't have to hunt about for the words, you also don't have to bother with the rhythms of your sentences. You don't have to think at all, since these phrases are generally so arranged as to be more or less euphonious. When you are, meaning the same thing, interchangeable. When you are composing in a hurry, when you are dictating to a stenographer, for instance, or making a public speech, it is natural to fall into a pretentious Latinized style. Tags like a consideration which we should do well to bear in mind, or a conclusion to which all of us would readily assent, will save many a sentence from coming down with a bump. By using stale metaphors, similes, and idioms, you save much mental effort at the cost of leaving your meaning vague, not only for your reader, but for yourself, and you come off like you have no soul. This is the significance of mixed metaphors. The sole aim of a metaphor is to call up a visual image. When these images clash, as in the fascist octopus has sung its swan song, the jackboot is thrown into the melting pot, it can be taken as certain that the writer is not seeing a mental image of the objects he is naming. Right? It's more like it's like a toddler banging on a piano or something. In other words, he is not really thinking. Look again at the examples I gave at the beginning of this essay. Professor Blabs-a-lot uses 5 negatives and 53 words. One of these passages is superfluous, making nonsense of the whole passage. And in addition, there is the slip alien for akin, making further nonsense, and several avoidable pieces of clumsiness, which increase the general vagueness. Professor Terrible Metaphor plays ducks and drakes with the battery which is able to write prescriptions, and while disapproving of the everyday phrase put up with, is unwilling to look egregious up in the dictionary and see what it means. Oh, burn. 3. If one takes an uncharitable attitude towards it, it's simply meaningless. Probably one could work out its intended meaning by reading the whole of the article in which it occurs. This was further up. If you remember earlier, the first few examples of bad modern writing, English writing. In 4, the writer knows more or less what he wants to say, but an accumulation of stale phrases chokes him like tea leaves blocking a sink. In 5, words and meanings have almost parted company. People who write in this manner usually have a general emotional meaning. They dislike one thing and want to express solidarity with another, but they are not interested in the detail of what they are saying. A scrupulous writer, in every sentence that he writes, will ask himself at least 4 questions. Not if you're an American. You want to ask yourself anything. You just go blah, blah, blah. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image will make it clearer? And is this image fresh enough to have an effect? All right, so let's play along. A scrupulous writer, in every sentence that he writes, will ask himself at least 4 questions thus. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? He says effect, not affect. And he will probably ask himself 2 more. Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? Right? Because he's talking about political language, right? And it's always it's a short jump from condemnation to killing and genocide. You can, but you are not obliged to go to all this trouble. You can shirk it by simply throwing your mind open and letting the ready-made phrases come crowding in. All the cool kids are doing it. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you to a certain extent, and at need, they will perform the important service of partially concealing your meaning even from yourself, right? That's the double think, right? Do you see where 1984 comes from? It is at this point that the special connection between politics and the debasement of language becomes clearer. In our time, it is broadly true that political writing is bad writing. Yes, and in America, the personal is political, so everything is bad writing. What I talked about before, you guys upsetting the poets and getting their ire, there's a reason why poets hate people. There's a reason why poets hate modern people in the modern age, generally speaking. Most philosophers and intellectuals, too. It's generally true, but I mean, and I'm not saying that they're all misanthropes. It's not the same thing. That's not the same thing as despising what herd mentality has done to language and the whole purpose of the herd mentality. It's politics, right? The state exists for the herd and the herd exists for the state. That's exactly what you see in 1984. The herd needed Big Brother. They were so insecure, they needed the perpetual security that, yes, you exist. Yes, you're going to live forever. You're just immortal. Nothing can go wrong. The Big Brother has you. Big Brother will love and enfold you forever, right? And that's what happened. That's the real, like, this is the real satire. The real satire is mind control. Because in reality, with enough bad language, you don't need actually to control people. You've already controlled how they think and feel. You've already won. That's the first half of the battle is conquering the mind, and then the second one is controlling it. And it's very easy, actually. In our time, broadly understood as bad writing, whereas not true, it will generally be found that the writer is some kind of rebel, expressing his private opinions and not a party line. Orthodoxy of whatever color seems to demand a lifeless imitative style, right? And it's just increasingly mono style in its newspeak. The political dialects to be found in pamphlets, leading articles, manifestos, white papers, and the speeches of undersecretaries do, of course, vary from party to party, but they are all alike, and it almost never finds in them a fresh, vivid, homespun turn of speech. Right, and what have I said before about this kind of stuff? It all tends towards one direction, because within context of herd or state, that's just it. You're stuck in a master-slave dialectic. There's no way around it. You have your God, you have your devil. It's all in one, right? And then that's the game that's played. When one watches some tired hack on the platform mechanically repeating the familiar phrases, bestial atrocities, iron heel, bloodstained tyranny, free peoples of the world, stand shoulder to shoulder, brr, 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 right? Brr, brr. One often has a curious feeling that one is not watching a live human being, but some kind of dummy. Oh, the biggest dummies. A feeling which suddenly becomes stronger at moments when the light catches the speaker's spectacles and turns them into blank discs, which seem to have no eyes behind them. Right? Very 1984, that imagery. And this is not altogether fanciful. A speaker who uses that kind of phraseology has gone some distance towards turning himself into a machine, right? Like a duck, the quacking of a duck. The appropriate noises are coming out of his larynx, but his brain is not involved as it would be here as if he were choosing his words for himself. Why would you need your brain? For modern life? Pfft. If the speech he is making is one that he is accustomed to making over and over again, he may be almost unconscious of what he is saying, as one is when he utters the responses in church. Amen. And this reduced state of consciousness, if not indispensable, is at any rate favorable to political conformity. In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. That's what you guys are all doing. That's what you guys are doing. Games up, games up. Everyone knows it. Not everyone, but they're either playing along or they're shaking their head. Things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face, and which do not square with the profound aims of political parties. Right? This is why Stalin could say the death of a million is a tragedy, or the death of one is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic, right? It's part of the rounding down error. The joke is that the individual ever mattered at all. That's exactly what 1984 illustrates, right? That the individual does not matter because the herd is more important. Their safety, their security, even if it means destroying everyone and everything, even if it means creating a bland, terrible, stupid society run on stupid politics that are in fact unworkable in real life, right? It shows you how bad it is. So political speech is the defense of the indefensible. So only by arguments which are too brute, right? That's why you have to round it down. That's why you have to use doublespeak. And the funny thing about doublespeak and newspeak is that a lot of trolls don't understand. A lot of average people just don't understand. And you can hear the head job because they go, and I've discussed this before, but I'm going to say it again. They go, these politicians are stupid. How can they say these things? How do people believe them? People are stupid for believing. It's like, that's the head job, dummy. You just missed it. They pulled it on you. The fact that you think they're dumb, that's part of the head job. The fact that you think it's ineffectual is part of the head job because it's super effectual. Anyway, going on here. Thus, political, like how else do a minority manipulate a majority? Do you not understand this stuff, guys? And I know you don't. That's why I'm explaining it. And why Orwell wrote this for you. So you have to learn how to compete. Things like the continuance, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Political language has to consist largely of euphemism, yes. Death of one is a statistic. Death of a million is hilarious. Question begging and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called the transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Right, great. Work for PR, man. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Oh, and you can see this in a lot of when people screw up, when people have to do public apologies and things like that. It becomes very political, right? This is personal becoming political. I so and so who have a brand to protect. Here's my curvy, worvy, spacey, wacy, nonsense, gibberish apology. I'm sorry I got caught. Please let me continue to make money here, right? Please let me keep my power, like, right? That's kind of the negotiation and the bargaining that's going on there. So let's see, moving on. He cannot say outright, oh, here we go. Consider, for instance, Some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. Probably, therefore, he will say something like this, right? He's not going to say, I'm for genocide. Instead, he will say, while freely concealing that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the... I'm bored already. Yeah, that's fine. Do whatever you need, man. Right? See, like, I think most people, like, they're just going to be bored and they're just going to say, okay, whatever. And that's how you win people's votes, is you just bore them, confuse them. I think agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of the transitional periods, that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. Right? You almost forget they're talking about genocide. But I was going to say that in American politics, we're not even like they're not even that good at their like we our the general education level is, it's like probably like down to third or fifth grade or something in total, right? So generally all our political language is kind of done that, so the general public, right? So the average person, right? Because remember, the average person is the voter here. That's the illusion, at least, right? That their choices of Coke or Pepsi matter, right? And then that's the point of the double speak and the new speak, is to make you forget that no, your choices don't matter because there's only one party, right? And it's the corporation. But moving on, the inflated style is itself a kind of euphemism. A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outlines and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is gaps between one's real and one's declared aims. Irony, that's the tyranny of irony. I'm just pointing this out for you. When there's a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, right, especially when you're knowingly manipulating people, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. And see, these are his original, metaphors here. And he's much better at calling forth images, right? If you could think of political writers, they're like little cuttlefish, right? Little sneaky creatures ready to jet out their black ink or blend in. So it's also a good metaphor for the type of person. Um, and see how I'm using that metaphor to now dehumanize, right? See how we do that? Parasites. In our age, there's no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues. And politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. I'm going to repeat that. Orwell writes, all issues are political issues. Keeping out of politics is impossible in our age. And politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. Hear, hear. And think about the kind of people who want to play in that cesspit, right? Who enjoy that cesspit too. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find, this is a guess which I have not sufficient knowledge to verify, that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years as a result of dictatorship. Yes, it's exactly what placating a herd does. It's exactly what controlling a mob of humanity, a mob of millions, trying to control mobs of millions of people. Think of how insane that is. But if thought corrupts language can also corrupt thought, right? The whole thesis of 1984 right here. But if thought corrupts language can also corrupt thought. You can literally manufacture memories and beliefs for people, right? This is what cult leaders do. This is what political leaders do, right? You can make up a people, like basically America's history was written in the last like 50 years, basically. Our modern history was. And that was rewritten from previously, which was rewritten from a bunch of cult rejects from Europe in a lot of senses. But a bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better. The debased language that I have been discussing is in some ways very convenient. Phrases like a not unjustifiable assumption leaves much to be desired, would serve no good purpose, a consideration which we should do well to bear in mind, or a continuous temptation, a packet of aspirins always at one's elbow. So he's talking about that, yes, in political writing, it's tempting to turn to these ready-made phrases. It's tempting to insert some jargon to cover a gap or hide what you mean, or just kind of get it over with. Just to be lazy, right? because I think that's, more than any kind of accusation, is just human laziness, really. Look back through this essay, and for certainty, you will find that I have again and again committed the very faults I am protesting against. By this morning's post, right, and this is the irony of using irony. By this morning's post, I have recently received a pamphlet dealing with conditions in Germany. The author tells me that he felt impelled to write it. I open it at random, and here is almost the first sentence that I see. The Allies have an opportunity not only of achieving radical transformation of Germany's social and political structure in such a way as to avoid a nationalistic reaction in Germany itself. So if you understand the psychopathic nature, like whatever dipshit wrote this political pamphlet is basically sitting here going like, oh dude, how can we control these mobs of Germans, right? God knows they need to be controlled, right? Is that what they learned in World War II? But at the same time of laying the foundations of a cooperative and unified Europe, you see, he feels impelled to write, feels, presumably, that he has something new to say, and yet his words, like cavalry horses answering the bugle, group themselves automatically into a familiar dreary pattern of control. This invasion of one's mind by ready-made phrases, lay the foundations, achieve a radical transformation, can only be prevented if one is constantly on guard against them. And why are you so paranoid, Orwell? What are you trying to hide? Right? Like he's missing the point here. The point of political language is to change and affect you and to attack your guard, right? Is to get you while your guard is down. And every such phrase anesthetizes a portion of one's brain. Yes, modern culture, modern life. If your brain, like it seems like brain anesthetization is the default for a lot of people, period. And then everything else just further serves, especially with how the brain dead nature of politics and political language, especially in a illiterate country like America. I said earlier that the decadence of our language is probably curable. Those who deny this would argue, if they produced an argument at all, that language merely reflects existing social conditions and that we cannot influence its development by... Yeah, get wrecked, posers. These are just bad writers who want you to think that you're helpless when you're not. By any directing tinkering with words and constructions. No, of course, writers, words, art always inspires it, right? It's to get us past the mental ruts and the stale images we've been stuck in, right? That's why you need new art, new images, new writers, right? That's why you don't write the same bad writing for hundreds of years, right? And to, the effect of that is going to be decay and decadence, as he's saying, as we've witnessed, as we live. So he goes on, so far as the general tone or spirit of a language goes, this may be true, but is not true in detail. Silly words and expressions have often disappeared not through any evolutionary process, but owing to the conscious action of a minority. Two recent examples were explore every avenue and leave no stone unturned, which were killed by the jeers of a few journalists. There's a long list of fly-blown metaphors which could similarly be got rid of if enough people would interest themselves in the job, and it should also be possible to laugh at the unformation, at the not unformation out of existence, to reduce the amount of Latin and Greek in the average sentence, to drive out foreign phrases and strayed scientific words, and in general to make pretentiousness unfashionable. But all the right relatableness, clearer communication, but all these are minor points. The defense of the English language implies more than this, and perhaps it is best to start by saying what it does not imply. So he goes on. To begin with, it has nothing to do with archaism or the salvaging of obsolete words and turns of speech, or with the setting up of a standard of English which must never be departed from, right? We already have all that. On the contrary, it is especially concerned with the scrapping of every word or idiom which has outworn its usefulness. It has nothing to do with correct grammar and syntax, right? He's not criticizing poetic or creative writing, which are of no importance so long as one makes one's meanings clear, and with the avoidance of Americanisms. Sorry, Orwell, you got the jackboot on your face forever there. Or with having what is called a good prose style, right? He's saying it's not limited to these things. It's not all about those things. On the other hand, it's not concerned with fake simplicity in the attempt to make written English colloquial, right? He's saying it's not about dumbing it down for the herd either, right? Nor does it even imply in every case preferring the Saxon word to the Latin one, although it does imply using the fewest and shortest words that will cover one's meaning, right? Clarity. What is above all needed is to let the meaning choose the word and not the other way around. In prose, the worst thing one can do with words is to surrender to them, right? Just to get drunk on them. Just go, oh, look at all these symbols. Doesn't it sound cool? Doesn't it sound? No, if you can't actually connect them to any reality, as I've discussed before with Emerson discussing, right? Everyone may imitate a language's prose and style, but only certain writers have the ability to actually clear all the crap and the lack of clarity away to again fasten words to visible objects. It's not, people think it's magic only because there is a certain word hypnosis that happens. Anyway, going on. When you think of a concrete object, you think wordlessly. And then if you want to describe the thing you've been visualizing, you probably hunt about till you find the exact words that seem to fit it. And it depends on your type, right? Different people think and see the world in very different ways, right? Not everyone sees, thinks, or feels the same. To the degrees that the American herd believes its own conditioning and what it's been told about itself, no, people are not equal and people are not remotely the same in ability and value and language and understanding and memory and the conditions they're born in. No one and nothing is equal. When you think of something abstract, you're more inclined to use words from the start. Unless you make a conscious effort to prevent it, the existing dialect will come rushing in and do the job for you. Yeah, like bro, man, at the expense of blurring or even changing your meaning. Probably it's better to put off using words as long as possible and get one's meanings as clear as can through pictures and sensations. Wow, he's really slowing it down and breaking it down. Basically going like, these animals don't even realize what they're doing, so let's kind of like separate and demystify these processes here. Afterward, one can choose, not simply accept, the phrases, right? One is no longer being a parrot. One is no longer being a donkey and just saying yee-haw, yee-haw, right? Yee-haw, like the donkey says, or Polly want a cracker. Afterward, one can choose, not simply accept, the phrases that will best cover the meaning and then switch around and decide what impression one's words are likely to make on another person. The last effort of the mind cuts out all stale or mixed images, right? Because you're actually considering your audience. Who's going to hear this? Can they stomach me and can I stomach them? Can I stomach looking them in the eye, or am I just manipulating and lying? No one really asks that, though. They're innocent. All prefabricated phrases, needless repetitions, and humbugs and vagueness generally. But one can often be in doubt about the effect of a word or a phrase, and one needs rules that one can rely on when instincts fail. I think the following rules will cover most cases. Uh-oh. I'd hate to see how Americans generally stand here. 1. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Oh, that's all they do. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. Well, I guess that's the problem with the nation of political writing, is like we've got this down to the simple and dumbest science. Like I said, just 100 years of like Skinner brain manipulation, and that's all there is to modern psychology anymore. It's just manipulation. There's no concern for mankind or evolution or the brain or the future or anything. It's all just manipulation. It really is insane. Never use passive where you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. He says, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Oh, and this is where Americans fail. The Americans, like you've just seen the mask come off in recent years. I've seen Americans of all colors, races, politics say the most hideous, barbarous, stupid, embarrassing things. They're not a civilized country. They're not civilized people, not even sitting in office. They don't even have to pretend anymore half the time, right? They just blather on. I know in recent days they've toned it down a bit, right? Kind of intelligently so, after they've continued to reap their own consequences of their actions and their words and their politics. Right? So it's kind of interesting to see that, oh, like these manipulators and these crazy political people, they do learn, they do adapt, right? You can see it in real time. But he goes on. Remember that was the last rule. Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. These rules sound elementary, and so they are, but they demand a deep change of attitude in anyone who has grown up used to writing in the style now fashionable. One could keep all of them and still write bad English, but one could not write the kind of stuff that I quoted in those 5 specimens at the beginning of this article. I've not here been considering the literary use of language, but merely language as an instrument for expressing and not for concealing or preventing thought. Right? See, there's the difference. All right, 1984, politics in the English language. Why do politicians actually speak this way? Why does the state use this language? Why do people behave this way, right? Stuart Chase and others have come near to claiming that all abstract words are meaningless and have used this as a pretext for advocating a kind of political quietism. Since you don't know what fascism is, how can you struggle against fascism? One need not swallow such absurdities as this, but one ought to recognize that the present political chaos is connected with the decay of language, and that one can probably bring about some improvement by starting at the verbal end. Right? If anyone wants to get elected, you start with your words, right? Like I think a lot of like you see that with the laziness of our system, they don't even they just run some they need a lot of money to run the same advertising over and over again. But if you're trying to get in, you start with your words, right? How else do you communicate with people? And that goes with anyone, not just politics. Or you could say that's the politics of humanity. No matter where you go, you have to consider and work with other people. And if you don't, that usually makes, well, it just depends. It depends on where you stand on the slave and tyrant side of things. Uh, Going on. So it's related to the decay of language, that is political chaos. Can probably bring about improvement by starting at the verbal end. If you simplify your English, you are freed from the worst follies of orthodoxy. You cannot speak any of the necessary dialects, and when you make a stupid remark, its stupidity will be obvious, even to yourself. Political language, as with variations, this is true of all political parties, from conservatives to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound untruthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. I'm going to read that again. Political language, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, from conservatives to liberals to socialists to Marxists to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. Right? The revolution is coming, Krusty's going to be here, whatever the fever dream is. One cannot change this all in a moment, but one can at least change one's own habits. And from time to time, one can even, if one jeers loudly enough, right, talk shit loudly enough, make fun of enough, because God, you guys are dorks. Political people in America are the worst. Send some worn out and useless phrase, some jackboot, Achilles heel, hotbed, melting pot, acid test, veritable inferno, or other lump of verbal refuse into the dustbin where it belongs. Yes, thank you, Mr. Orwell. I am for real. Never meant to make your daughter cry. Number one. An interesting these are the footnotes. An interesting illustration of this is the way in which the English flower names, which were in use till very recently, are being ousted by the Greek ones. Snapdragon became Anternium, Forget-me-not became Mycetosis, etc. It's hard to see any practical reason for this change of fashion. It's probably due to an instinctive turning away from the more homely word and a vague feeling that a Greek word is scientific. Right, he's basically just saying there's pretentious trends in language by people who don't know what they're doing or why. Snapdragon is a beautiful name for a flower. It really gives you a picture of what this thing might look like too. Example, comforts Catholicity of perception and imagery, strangely Whitmanesque in range, almost the exact opposite in aesthetic compulsion, continues to evoke that trembling atmospheric accumulativeness, hinting at a cruel and inexorably serene timelessness. Ray Gardner scores by aiming at a simple bullseye with precision, only they are not so simple, and through this contented sadness runs more than the surface bittersweet of resignation. That's Poetry Quarterly. I think that was an example of pretentious art writing. Oh God, I've seen so much. Or it's like you have a visual piece and then they write a brick of a paragraph to explain the visual piece. Throw the writing out. You're not a writer, you're a fucking painter, dumbass. God, right? You don't trust your, like that, and it shows you what they're doing, right? It shows you that they either failed at their visual art, right? Hence they need paragraphs of writing, or it means they don't trust the reader with what they were trying to transmit, or the viewer with what they're trying to transmit, which also means they're a hackneyed artist or that they failed somehow in what they were doing. Either way, they're blending fact and fiction. They're blending their personal art with politics of a party. I hope I said that well. I think I did. And then I think the last reference in here, one can cure oneself of the not unformation. Oh yeah, right. He's talking about the pretentious not un, right? It is not unlike. It is not unquite like, that kind of stuff. One can cure oneself of the not unformation by memorizing the sentence. A not unblack dog was chasing a not unsmall rabbit across a not ungreen field, right? Double negatives. They all cancel each other out. That's why he's kind of suggesting just get rid of it. We don't need it, right? You're just being pretentious. You're padding your sentences with extra syllables for symmetry. Any good writer knows what you're doing. Any bad writer is going to be impressed or just take it at face value, or they're sadly used to it, right? So he's talking about cleaning up our language. And I implore all writers and non-writers alike to, especially in a culture and in a civilization where we are bigger consumers of language, or as big of a consumers of language as anything else, or maybe more than anything else, you guys need to be more critical. You need to when people aren't clear, ask for clarity, and then don't trust them, don't vote for them, don't believe them if they cannot be clear on what they mean. Don't buy the product if they can't be clear. If they're using this kind of nonstop, intentionally deceptive language, even if they're unconscious of it, understand what they're doing and why. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, I'm Zach Morkowski with Sharper Pen Image Consulting. This has been covering George Orwell's famous essay, Politics in the English Language, pretty much the thing that gave rise and birth to, there it is right there, gave rise to the thing that bore out, right? There you go. It's a little bit more, right? It could be some gun action or a creature boring through the earth kind of action, right? It was this essay which inspired 1984 in Orwell, gave him the dream of it. Oh shit, thoughts can control language. Well, what about a political oligarchy who figures out how to control the masses and herds of humanity simply by largely controlling their perception by controlling language? So remember, guys and gals, again, one more time, thanks for checking it out. And a not unblack dog was chasing a not unsmall rabbit across a not ungreen field. Thanks. Take care.